The sun was setting over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too perfect to be real. From the Hollywood hills, the city lights twinkled like stars fallen to earth. But behind the glamorous facade, things were changing in ways most people couldn't see. In a glass-walled conference room 40 floors above Sunset Boulevard, studio executives gathered around a table littered with empty coffee cups and half-eaten sandwiches. The quarterly numbers were in, and they weren't good. Box office down 17% compared to last year, said the chief financial officer, a woman with tired eyes who hadn't seen her children awake in 3 days. Production costs up nearly 30%. And these streaming numbers? She shook her head, not needing to finish the sentence. The studio head, a man who had climbed his way up from the mailroom 30 years ago, loosened his tie. It's just a temporary dip. The pandemic changed viewing habits, but people will come back to theaters. They always do. But even as he said it, he didn't quite believe it himself. Something fundamental was shifting, and deep down, everyone in the room knew it. Across town, in a much less impressive building with mismatched furniture and walls covered in movie posters, a different kind of meeting was happening. A group of young filmmakers, data analysts, and tech specialists huddled around screens showing charts and graphs. "The data doesn't lie," said one, pointing to a pattern on the screen. "The audience is evolving faster than the industry can keep up. They don't just want different stories, they want different ways to experience them." A filmmaker in the corner spoke up. "The studios are still operating like it's 2005. They're spending hundreds of millions on movies that people watch once and forget, while ignoring the content that actually builds communities." What these two meetings represented was a divide. Growing within Hollywood, those clinging to the old ways, and those who could see the coming storm. And it wasn't just about streaming versus theaters. It was something much bigger. In her apartment in Burbank, a veteran script supervisor watched her bank account dwindle. She hadn't had steady work in 18 months. Productions that once would have hired her were now using new systems that automated much of her job. She'd been in the industry for 25 years, had credits on films that won Oscars, but suddenly, her phone wasn't ringing. "It's not just me," she told her friend over the phone. "Half the people I know are struggling. The work is different now, fewer big productions, more content that needs to be made quickly and cheaply. The middle has fallen out." Meanwhile, at one of the major talent agencies, agents were having their own crisis. An assistant brought in a report showing that social media influencers were now generating more audience engagement than many A-list movie stars. For projects aimed at viewers under 30, having the right YouTuber or TikTok personality attached could be more valuable than an actor with a shelf full of awards. "We need to adapt," said one agent, younger than most in the room. "The definition of star power is changing before our eyes," an older agent scoffed. "People will always want real stars. This internet celebrity thing is a fad," but the numbers told a different story. In a small effects house in North Hollywood, a team that had once been 40 people was now just 8. But they were producing nearly the same amount of work. New software tools had changed what was possible, allowing smaller teams to create visual effects that once required hundreds of artists. "The big VFX companies are scared," said the owner, watching his team work. "They've built business models around having armies of artists. But what happens when you don't need an army anymore?" Similar changes were happening in every corner of the industry. Writers found themselves competing with AI systems that could generate basic scripts and treatments. Cinematographers watched as new camera systems made it possible for smaller crews to capture images that once required dozens of technicians. Editors saw their timeline for cutting a film shrink from months to weeks. And yet, to the outside world, Hollywood appeared unchanged. The same studios released the same kinds of blockbusters. The same stars walked red carpets. The same trades reported the same box office numbers. But those who knew where to look could see the cracks forming. In a college film program, students learned techniques that would have seemed like science fiction just 5 years earlier. They could create convincing visual effects on laptops, record professional quality sound on phones, and distribute their work to potential audiences of millions without ever dealing with a traditional studio. "You're entering an industry in transformation," their professor told them. "The rules that existed when I started won't apply for you." Some students found this terrifying. Others saw opportunity. At the major studios in departments far from the executive suites, data analysts were seeing patterns that worried them. Audience attention was fragmenting. The formula that had reliably produced hits was becoming less predictable. International markets that had saved many expensive films from failure were developing their own entertainment industries. Becoming less reliant on Hollywood. Imports. We should be sounding the alarm, one analyst told his supervisor. The people upstairs don't want to hear it, was the reply. This disconnect between what was happening at ground level and what was being acknowledged in public created a strange atmosphere throughout Hollywood. In private conversations at industry parties, people spoke of fundamental change. In official statements and interviews, everything was business as usual. A longtime producer, waiting for her car after a meeting, found herself talking to a young director whose first film had just been released directly to streaming. "How do you see the industry in 5 years?" the producer asked. The director laughed. "Unrecognizable. The studio system as it exists now won't survive. Too expensive, too slow, too disconnected from how people actually consume stories now." "And you're okay with that?" the producer asked, genuinely curious. "I never knew the old Hollywood," the director said. "I grew up making videos online. To me, this evolution feels natural." That night, as darkness fell over the city, millions of people around the world were watching content created in Hollywood. But fewer were watching it in theaters. Fewer were watching it on traditional television. Instead, they watched on phones, tablets, computers, and gaming systems. They paused, rewatched, commented, shared clips, created reaction videos, and engaged in ways that weren't possible in previous eras. And in offices throughout Hollywood, on computers protected by the highest levels of security, algorithms analyzed all of this behavior, learning what kept people watching, what made them share, what caused them to subscribe or unsubscribe. This data was becoming as valuable as any star or franchise. A security guard making his rounds through one of the big studio lots passed sound stages that had created movie magic for generations. Some were busy with productions, but others sat empty more often than not. He'd worked there for 12 years and had seen the gradual change. Fewer big productions filling the calendar. More empty days, more uncertainty. "It's different now," he told a colleague as they checked doors and windows. "Used to be you could feel the energy of this place day and night. Now it comes and goes." What none of them fully understood yet, not the executives, not the filmmakers, not the crew members or the agents or the analysts, was that they were living through not just a change but a complete reinvention of an industry. The silent revolution happening in Hollywood wasn't just about how movies were made or where people watched them. It was about the entire relationship between creators and audiences, between stories and the people who consumed them. And as the city slept, the algorithms kept learning, the platforms kept growing, and the foundation of what had been called Hollywood for 100 years continued its invisible transformation into something new, something most people had no idea was coming. The morning sun streamed through the blinds of a corner office in one of Hollywood's oldest studios. The head of production stared at a presentation on her laptop, coffee growing cold beside her. What she was looking at both fascinated and terrified her. "You're saying this system can predict audience reaction with 87% accuracy?" she asked the tech consultant sitting across from her. "For certain genres, yes," he replied. "It analyzes thousands of successful films and shows, breaking them down scene by scene, line by line, tracking emotional beats, visual patterns, even subtle things like color grading and music cues. Then it can apply that learning to new scripts." She closed her laptop slowly. "And the board wants this implemented by next quarter." It wasn't a question. The decision had already been made above her head. After decades of trusting gut instinct and experience, the studio was turning to algorithms to help decide what stories would be told. Across town, in a warehouse converted into a production space, a group of independent filmmakers were already 2 steps ahead. They had been experimenting with new tools that could generate storyboards instantly, suggest dialogue alternatives, and even create rough visual effects that once would have required months of work. "Look at this," said a director, showing his cinematographer a sequence the computer had generated based on his written description. "It's not perfect, but it's giving us options we wouldn't have considered." The cinematographer studied it carefully. "It's interesting. Not how I would have shot it, but that's kind of the point, right? It thinks differently than we do." This was the new reality slowly taking hold in Hollywood. Advanced systems weren't replacing human creativity. Not exactly. They were augmenting it, challenging it, sometimes enhancing it, and different people were reacting in vastly different ways. In a writer's room for a popular streaming show, tension filled the air. Half the team embraced the new tools that could suggest plot developments and character arcs. The other half refused to even look at the computer-generated ideas. "I've been writing for 20 years, said one veteran, pushing away from the table. "I'm not about to let some algorithm tell me how to craft a story." A younger writer sighed. "No one's saying let it write for us. But why not use it as another tool, like spell check or grammar suggestions, just more advanced?" "Because once you open that door," the veteran replied, "where does it end?" It was a question many were asking as these new systems rapidly evolved. What had started as simple assistance tools were becoming sophisticated collaborators, and the results were impossible to ignore. In a hidden facility in the San Fernando Valley, one of the biggest studios had set up what employees called the Future Lab. Here, away from public eyes, they tested the most advanced applications. A team had been working for months on a system that could not just assist, but generate entire first drafts of scripts based on minimal input. Give it a genre, some character archetypes, and a basic premise, explained the lead engineer to visiting executives. Within hours, it produces a complete draft. Not final quality, but impressive enough that it saves writers weeks of work. The studio executives watched the demonstration with poker faces, but their minds raced with implications. If one writer with these tools could do the work of 5, what did that mean for their business model? For the industry as a whole? Meanwhile, casting directors found their profession transforming too. New software could analyze an actor's previous performances, vocal patterns, physical movements, and audience reception, then predict how they might embody a new character. "It helps us consider people we might have overlooked," admitted one casting director to a colleague over lunch. "Last week it suggested an actor I never would have thought of for the lead role. But when I watched their previous work with the system's analysis, I saw something I'd missed before. They ended up being perfect." Not everyone was as enthusiastic. At a bar frequented by industry professionals, a group of actors shared their experiences with the new reality. "I had an audition last week where they didn't even want to see me read," said one. "They just took a scan of my face and body, fed it into some system along with clips of my previous roles, and said they'd let me know. How am I supposed to show what I can bring to a character? It's even worse for voice work," added another. "These systems can already mimic human speech so well. Voice actors for commercials and smaller parts are seeing jobs disappear." But as concerning as these developments were for some, others saw unprecedented opportunity. A director who had struggled to break into the traditional system had recently released a film that was gaining serious attention. She had embraced the new tools completely, using them to achieve visual effects and production value that would have been impossible on her budget just a few years earlier. "The gatekeepers don't matter as much anymore," she told an interviewer from an online film site. "When I started, you needed millions of dollars in studio backing to make something that looked professional. Now I can create nearly anything I can imagine with a small team in these new tools." Her film had caught the eye of audiences and critics alike, not because of its technology but because of its unique story, one that traditional studios had passed on as too risky. In the executive dining room of one major studio, the CEO met with his top team. The quarterly numbers showed a troubling pattern. Their big-budget, algorithm-approved projects were performing adequately but not spectacularly. Meanwhile, smaller productions using these new tools creatively were building passionate audiences at a fraction of the cost. "We need to understand what's happening," the CEO said. "We're playing it safe, using this technology to minimize risk, while the independents are using it to take bigger creative swings, and audiences are responding to their boldness." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. The studio had spent billions building systems designed to create predictable success. But art at its best was never predictable. In film schools and online communities, a new generation of storytellers was emerging with no allegiance to the old ways. They had grown up in a digital world, and to them, these new tools were simply part of the creative process, no different than cameras or editing software. A professor at one prestigious film program observed the shift in his students. "The ones who will define the future aren't fighting the technology. They're finding ways to use it that we haven't even considered. They see these systems not as threats but as collaborators that free them to focus on what makes stories uniquely human: emotional truth." As the sun set over the Hollywood sign, casting long shadows, a group of friends, a mix of industry veterans and newcomers, gathered on a rooftop. Their conversation drifted between excitement and concern about the changes they were witnessing. "I think about the history of film," said one, a cinematographer with decades of experience. "Every technological advance was first feared, then embraced. Sound, color, digital cameras, each was going to be the end of the art form. Instead, they expanded what was possible. But this feels different," countered a writer. "Those changes were tools in human hands. This is something that can generate ideas on its own." A young director who had been quiet spoke up. "But it can't feel on its own. It can't know what it means to be human. Everything it creates is built from what we've already made, what we've taught it. The soul of storytelling still comes from us." The conversation continued into the night, echoing similar discussions happening throughout Hollywood. The industry stood at a crossroads, with some rushing to embrace the future, others fighting to preserve tradition, and many caught somewhere in between. In a small screening room, a test audience watched a film without knowing its unusual development process. Half the script had been generated by the newest systems, then refined by human writers. Some visual sequences had been created entirely digitally, based on the director's descriptions rather than traditional storyboarding and photography. As the credits rolled, the audience filled out their reaction cards. Their responses showed no awareness of the film's hybrid creation. They commented on characters, emotional moments, surprising plot turns, all the elements that had always made stories connect with people. What none of them knew was that they were witnessing the beginning of a new era in Hollywood. The technology wasn't replacing the human element of storytelling. It was transforming how that human element was expressed. And the full implications of that transformation were only starting to become clear. Rain pounded the streets of Los Angeles, unusual for the season. Inside a small theater in Silver Lake, a crowd had gathered for the premiere of an independent film that had been generating online buzz for weeks. The filmmaker, a 30-something director who had never worked with a major studio, stood nervously in the back as the lights dimmed. What the audience didn't know was that this film had been made for less than $1 million, a tiny fraction of what major studios typically spent. Using new production techniques and embracing collaborative tools that most traditional filmmakers still viewed with suspicion, the director had created something that looked and felt like it cost 20 times more. 2 hours later, as the credits rolled, the audience erupted in applause. People were wiping away tears, turning to strangers next to them to discuss what they'd just experienced. The filmmaker could hardly believe the reaction. "That was incredible," said a well-known critic, approaching the director afterward. "How did you pull off those visual sequences on an indie budget?" The director smiled. "We found new ways to work. Our team was small, but the tools we used multiplied what we could do." What no one in that room fully understood was that they were witnessing a pivotal moment, the start of what would later be called the Great Disruption of Hollywood. The same week, across town, studio executives gathered in an emergency meeting. Their summer tentpole film, budgeted at over $250 million with another $150 million spent on marketing, had just opened to disastrous numbers. It was the third major failure for the studio that year. "The audience just didn't show up," said the head of distribution, his voice strained. "Not even internationally, where we usually recoup our losses." The studio chief, looking at the financial projections, felt a chill. "If this continues, we'll need to explain to shareholders why our model isn't working anymore." Outside, billboards for the failed blockbuster loomed over Sunset Boulevard, already seeming like relics of a fading era. The contrast between these two events rippled through Hollywood in the following days. Industry newsletters and trade publications began running stories analyzing what had happened. How had a small independent film with no major stars created more audience excitement than a massive studio production with every advantage? At a popular industry lunch spot, a group of producers discussed the situation over salads and iced tea. "It's not just one film," said a veteran producer who had worked on dozens of major movies. "It's a pattern. Big budgets aren't translating to big returns anymore. Meanwhile, these smaller productions that are using new methods are connecting with audiences in ways we're struggling to match." A younger producer nodded. "The indie that premiered last week? They use generative tools for pre-visualization, script analysis, even some of the music composition. Their post-production team was 5 people doing the work that would have required 50 people 5 years ago." But surely the quality suffers, argued another, who had built his career in the traditional system. That's just it, it doesn't, replied the younger producer. Sometimes it's even better because they can try more variations, explore more creative options. The technology gives them flexibility that big productions don't have because of their rigid structures and massive overhead. As these conversations spread throughout Hollywood, financial reality began forcing change even among those most resistant to it. A major talent agency announced a restructuring, laying off dozens of agents who represented mid-level talent. Their statement mentioned adapting to evolving market conditions. What they didn't say publicly was that the middle of the market was collapsing. There were still massive paychecks for the biggest stars, but roles that would have provided comfortable livings for working actors were disappearing as production budgets shifted and new methods required fewer people. The disruption wasn't limited to creative roles. In studio offices throughout the city, departments that had existed for decades began shrinking or disappearing entirely. Marketing teams that once crafted campaigns based on intuition and experience found themselves replaced by smaller groups armed with data analysis tools that could predict audience response with remarkable accuracy. An industry conference hastily organized to address the future of entertainment. A panel of experts tried to make sense of what was happening. We're seeing a fundamental shift in the power dynamics of this industry, explained an economist who specialized in entertainment business models. For a century, the major studios held power because production and distribution required massive capital investment. Only they could afford to make and release films globally. That barrier has now collapsed. A studio executive on the panel shook his head. You're overstating this. Yes, technology is changing some aspects of production, but audiences still want spectacle, big stars, and marketing campaigns that make movies into events. From the audience, a hand went up. It belonged to the director of the independent film that had started all this discussion. With respect, they said, I think you're missing what's really happening. Audiences don't care about how much something costs to make. They care about the emotional experience. Our film connected because we spent our limited resources on the story and used these new tools to enhance it, not as a replacement for human creativity, but as an extension of it. The room fell silent as people absorbed this perspective. Meanwhile, financial markets were reacting to the shifting landscape. Stock prices of traditional entertainment companies began a steady decline as investors questioned their ability to adapt. Venture capital, on the other hand, flooded into startups developing new production tools, alternative distribution platforms, and creative technologies. In a high-rise office building downtown, investment bankers met with representatives from a major tech company that was considering acquiring one of Hollywood's oldest studios. Their content library still has value, explained one banker, and the brand recognition is strong, but their production model needs complete reinvention. They're creating content the way they did 20 years ago, just with better special effects and higher costs. The tech company's chief strategy officer nodded. If we move forward, we'd maintain the brand but transform the infrastructure. Our algorithms already know more about audience preferences than their development teams. We can make better content for less money and distribute it more effectively. This cold financial calculation was playing out in boardrooms across the entertainment landscape. Companies that had dominated for generations suddenly found themselves valued more for their existing content libraries than for their ability to create new hits. The human cost of this transformation was becoming visible. Throughout Los Angeles, at a coffee shop near Burbank, a group of crew members who had worked together on major productions for years met to share job leads. I've been a set designer for 15 years, said one. Now they want people who can work with virtual production systems. I'm trying to learn, but the technology changes so fast. Another nodded sympathetically. My department had 30 people last year. Now it's down to 8. And they're doing nearly the same amount of work. The studio says it's temporary restructuring, but we all know better. Not everyone saw the disruption as negative. At a tech incubator in Venice Beach, a group of former entertainment professionals had founded a company developing new storytelling tools that were gaining traction with independent creators. We saw this coming years ago, said the founder, who had left a major studio to start the company. The old system was incredibly inefficient and resistant to change. What we're building helps democratize production. People with great stories but limited resources can now bring their visions to life. Their company had just closed a significant funding round, and their software was being used by creators around the world, not just in Hollywood. As night fell over Los Angeles, a private screening room hosted a small group of industry power players. They watched 3 upcoming projects: a traditional studio blockbuster, a streaming service production, and the work of an independent team using the newest techniques. When the lights came up, there was an uncomfortable silence. The quality gap they had expected to see between the high and low budget productions wasn't there. In some ways, the independent project felt more innovative, more willing to take creative risks. "We need to adapt," said one executive finally, breaking the silence. "Not just incrementally. We need to rethink everything about how we work." Others nodded, the reality of their situation impossible to deny any longer. Outside, the rain had stopped. The Hollywood sign stood illuminated against the night sky, a symbol of an industry that had reinvented itself many times before. But this transformation would be different, more profound, more complete than the shift from silent films to talkies, from black and white to color, from film to digital. The great disruption of Hollywood had begun, and there would be no going back to the way things were before. Moving trucks lined the quiet streets of Studio City as the morning fog lifted. A woman in her 40s carefully packed framed movie posters into a box, memories of productions she had worked on over a 20-year career in Hollywood. After 6 months without steady work, she had made the difficult decision to leave California altogether. "I never thought I'd have to go," she told her neighbor, who was helping carry boxes to the truck. "But the reality is the industry I trained for doesn't exist anymore." She wasn't alone. All across Los Angeles, thousands of entertainment professionals were facing the same harsh reality. The transformation that had begun as whispers and warnings had accelerated into what industry papers now openly called the Great Hollywood Exodus. At what had once been the busiest studio lot in town, entire buildings stood empty. Security guards patrolled hallways where hundreds of executives and creative teams had once bustled about. After a series of box office disasters and a failed merger attempt, the legendary studio had declared bankruptcy. Its assets were being sold off piece by piece: the valuable real estate, the intellectual property, the equipment. A small group of employees gathered in the commissary for what would be their last lunch together. They represented departments that had been essential to the old Hollywood: physical production, traditional marketing, theatrical distribution. "Remember when getting a job here was the dream?" asked a distribution executive who had started as an assistant 15 years earlier. "My parents framed my first studio badge." Others nodded, sharing similar stories. Their careers had been built in an industry that operated on certain principles that no longer applied. The rules had changed too quickly for many of them to adapt. "My nephew makes content in his bedroom that gets more viewers than our last 3 theatrical releases combined," said another with a sad laugh. "And he does it with a phone and a laptop." Across town at the airport, a stream of private jets departed daily, carrying high-level executives to meetings in places that were quickly becoming the new centers of entertainment production. Atlanta, London, Toronto, Seoul, Mumbai, Mexico City. What had once been runaway production, films and shows shooting outside of Los Angeles for tax incentives, had evolved into something more permanent. Complete creative ecosystems were developing around the world, no longer dependent on Hollywood's infrastructure or approval. In a gleaming office tower in Seoul, American and Korean executives finalized the details of what would have been unthinkable just years earlier. A Korean entertainment conglomerate was acquiring one of Hollywood's Big 5 studios. The American studio, struggling with debt and declining market share, had little choice but to accept the offer. "We're not just buying a library and a logo," the Korean CEO explained to his team. "We're reimagining how global entertainment works. Hollywood will be one node in our network, not the center." The reality of this power shift was becoming impossible to ignore. For a century, Hollywood had been synonymous with the global entertainment industry. Now it was becoming just one player among many, and not necessarily the most innovative or financially stable one. Back in Los Angeles, a talent agent cleaned out his desk. After 15 years representing actors in film and television, his entire department had been eliminated. The agency, once among the most powerful in town, was restructuring to focus on digital talent, brand partnerships, and emerging platforms. They told me I could reapply for a position in the influencer division, he said to a colleague who was packing up the office next door. 20 years of relationship building in this town, and suddenly what matters is whether I understand TikTok algorithms. His colleague shook his head sympathetically. My 16-year-old makes more from her online content than half my client list did last year. The whole idea of who's a star is changing. This transformation in star power was perhaps the most visible aspect of Hollywood's upheaval. Actors who had commanded multi-million-dollar salaries found themselves competing for roles with online creators who brought built-in audiences of millions. Traditional celebrities discovered that their fame didn't necessarily translate to the new landscape, where authentic connection with viewers often mattered more than polished perfection or traditional acting training. At a coffee shop in West Hollywood, two actors in their 30s, both of whom had enjoyed steady careers in network television, discussed their uncertain futures. My last 3 auditions weren't even for traditional acting roles, said one. They wanted to know my social media following, whether I had my own production set up at home, if I could self-tape and self-edit. Her friend nodded. My agent suggested I start a podcast or a YouTube channel, said I need to build a direct relationship with an audience since the studio system can't guarantee work anymore. The exodus wasn't just of people, but of entire ways of working. Massive sound stages that had once been booked years in advance sat partially empty, while flexible technology-enabled production spaces thrived. The rigid hierarchy that had defined Hollywood productions for generations was flattening, with smaller, more adaptable teams becoming the norm. In a converted warehouse in Atlanta, a production was underway that symbolized the new reality. The director, who had left Los Angeles the previous year, moved between physical sets and virtual production screens where digital environments could be manipulated in real time. We're doing in weeks what used to take months, she explained to a visiting journalist, and with a crew a quarter of the size we would have needed in the old system. The journalist, who had covered Hollywood for decades, looked around in amazement. And the quality? Judge for yourself, the director said, showing completed sequences on a tablet. This approach gives us more creative options, not fewer. We can try things that would have been too expensive or time-consuming before. This was the painful irony for traditional Hollywood. The very tools and methods they had resisted were enabling a creative renaissance, just not on their terms or in their territory. At an industry conference in New York, financial analysts delivered blunt assessments of the entertainment landscape. Stock prices of traditional media companies had plummeted as investors recognized the fundamental challenges to their business models. Meanwhile, investment flowed to newer, more nimble companies built for the evolving ecosystem. The assets that once gave major studios their power, huge lots, massive distribution networks, exclusive talent deals, have become liabilities in many cases, explained one analyst. They're expensive to maintain and difficult to adapt to changing consumption patterns. In the audience, executives from the remaining major studios took notes grimly. Many had already begun the difficult process of downsizing and restructuring, trying to transform organizations built for one era to survive in another. For the countless entertainment professionals caught in this transformation, the personal toll was enormous. Skills honed over decades sometimes became obsolete in months. Networks of relationships that had taken years to build suddenly held less value in a landscape where direct connection with audiences mattered more than industry insider status. At a community center in North Hollywood, a nonprofit had started offering retraining programs for displaced entertainment workers. The waiting list stretched to hundreds of names. We see people from every department, every level, said the program director. Set decorators learning virtual production design, marketing executives studying data analysis, script supervisors becoming remote collaboration specialists. Some found the transition energizing, a chance to reinvent themselves. Others struggled with the sense that everything they had worked for had been swept away by forces beyond their control. As sunset painted the Hollywood hills in gold, a group gathered on a rooftop bar that had long been an industry hangout. They represented both the old guard and the new wave, some who had left major studios to start innovative companies, others trying to transform legacy institutions from within, and some who were still finding their place. in the new landscape. "I think what's happening now is like what happened when talkies replaced silent films," said a director who had worked in both traditional and new models. "Some careers ended, others began. The art form evolved, but people still wanted stories, just delivered in new ways." A former studio executive nodded. "Hollywood has always been more an idea than a place. Maybe that idea is just expanding beyond these city limits." As night fell completely, the Hollywood sign lit up in the distance. It stood as it always had, but the industry it represented was changing in ways its creators could never have imagined. The exodus wasn't just physical. It was the end of an era and the painful, exciting birth of something new. Morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows of a sleek building in downtown Los Angeles. 5 years had passed since the Great Disruption began, and what had emerged was neither the complete death of Hollywood that some had predicted, nor a return to the old ways that others had hoped for. Instead, something entirely new had taken shape. Inside the building, once the headquarters of a traditional movie studio, now operated what people called a creation hub. Gone were the rigid departments and hierarchies of old Hollywood. In their place was a fluid network of creators, technologists, and business specialists who came together in different configurations depending on the project. A woman in her 30s, who had started her career as a traditional film editor before embracing the new tools and methods, walked through the open workspace. Around her, small teams worked on projects that would have been impossible to categorize in the old Hollywood system. Were they films, games, interactive experiences? The boundaries had blurred to the point where such labels hardly mattered anymore. "We're launching the new story world next month," she told a colleague as they reviewed progress on a wall of screens. "The core narrative will release simultaneously in 70 countries, with regional teams adding culturally specific elements." This was the new normal. Global from inception, collaborative by design, and built to exist across multiple formats and platforms. The idea of a film being a single fixed experience viewed passively by an audience felt increasingly antiquated. Across the city, in what had once been the heart of the studio system, some of the old lots remained. They had been reimagined as production campuses where physical and virtual creation happened side by side. Traditional craftspeople worked alongside digital artists, each respecting the other's skills and finding new ways to combine them. A set designer who had nearly left the industry during the exodus had found a new role combining physical building techniques with virtual production. "I was ready to quit," he told a group of students touring the facility. "I thought my skills were obsolete. Then I realized that understanding physical spaces, how light works, how materials feel, how people move through environments, was even more valuable in creating convincing virtual worlds." This integration of old and new had saved some traditional roles while transforming others beyond recognition. The few major studios that had survived had done so by radical reinvention, shedding the bloated structures and rigid thinking that had nearly destroyed them. In a restored bungalow on one of these lots, executives from around the world gathered for a strategy meeting. They represented not a single company, but a network of creation hubs spanning 6 continents. "The audience numbers from Lagos are extraordinary," said one, reviewing data on a screen. "The localization team there has taken the core story and adapted it in ways we couldn't have imagined." Another nodded. "Same with the Bangalore hub. They've added elements that resonate deeply in their region but still connect to the central narrative." This was perhaps the most profound change in the new Hollywood, the decentralization of creative power. Stories no longer flowed primarily from Los Angeles to the rest of the world. Instead, a global network of creators built interconnected narratives that could be experienced in different ways in different cultures, yet still feel part of a coherent whole. In a coffee shop in Venice Beach, 2 friends who had worked together in the old system reflected on the transformation. One had been a studio marketing executive, the other a talent agent. Both had found new roles in the reshaped industry after initially resisting the changes. "Remember when we thought it was the end?" the former agent asked. "When the agencies were collapsing and the studios were declaring bankruptcy?" The former marketing executive nodded. "I was so focused on what was being lost that I couldn't see what was being created. Now I work with teams around the world instead of just here in LA. The stories are better for it." This was a common reflection among those who had survived the transition, an acknowledgement that while the Disruption had been painful. Many aspects of the new system were actually improvements on what had come before. The global nature of the new Hollywood was visible everywhere. On digital platforms, content from South Korea, Nigeria, India, and Brazil attracted audiences as large as anything from the United States. The cultural dominance that Hollywood had maintained for a century had given way to a more diverse landscape where stories from any part of the world could find global resonance. In a sleek office building in Seoul, a creative team reviewed candidates for a project that would have once been considered the exclusive domain of American creators. "We need perspectives from at least 3 continents for this to work," said the project lead. The audience expects that level of cultural depth now. This expectation had fundamentally changed how stories were created. The assumption that American perspectives were universal had been replaced by a recognition that truly global content required multiple cultural viewpoints from its inception, not just in marketing or distribution. Perhaps the most revolutionary change was in who could participate in creation. The democratization of tools had opened pathways for voices that would never have been heard in the old system. In a small apartment in Mexico City, a young creator with no formal film training put the finishing touches on a project that would be experienced by millions around the world. Using tools that had once been available only to major studios, but were now accessible to anyone with talent and vision, she had created something uniquely her own that would become part of a larger story world. "My grandmother told me these stories," she explained in a video call with collaborators from Tokyo, London, and Johannesburg. "Now they'll connect with your stories to create something none of us could have made alone." This collaborative approach had replaced the singular vision of the auteur-director or powerful producer as the dominant creative model. Individual voices still mattered, but they were now part of more complex creative ecosystems. Even the definition of success had transformed. In the old Hollywood, box office numbers or Nielsen ratings were the primary measures of value. In the new landscape, engagement metrics were more nuanced. How deeply did audiences connect with the story? How did they participate in extending it? How did it perform across multiple platforms and formats? At an award ceremony held simultaneously in Los Angeles, Mumbai, and London, the most celebrated projects were those that had pushed boundaries not just in storytelling but in how stories were experienced. Categories recognized excellence in interactive narrative, collaborative creation, and cross-cultural adaptation alongside more traditional filmmaking crafts. A Lifetime Achievement Award went to a director who had begun her career in the old Hollywood system but had embraced the transformation and helped shape the new reality. When everything started to change, "I had a choice," she said, addressing audiences around the world. "I could cling to the way things had always been done, or I could see the potential in what was emerging. I'm grateful every day that I chose the latter." Her words resonated with many who had lived through the disruption. The painful exodus, the loss of familiar structures, the uncertainty, all had given way to new possibilities that many now recognized as improvements. As the sun set over the Hollywood sign, a group of students from a global film program sat on the hillside overlooking the city. They had come from a dozen countries to learn about storytelling in its many forms, part of the first generation for whom the new Hollywood was all they had ever known. "It's strange to think there was a time when everything was centered here," said one, looking out over the sprawling city, "when you had to move to this specific place to have a chance at reaching an audience." Another nodded. "My uncle worked in the old system. He says the tools we take for granted would have seemed like magic to him when he started. But he also says the most important things haven't changed. The need to understand human emotions, to create characters people care about, to tell stories that matter." This was the paradox of the new Hollywood. In some ways, it barely resembled the industry that had dominated global entertainment for a century. The centralized power, the exclusive access, the rigid structures, all had been transformed beyond recognition. Yet the fundamental purpose to create stories that moved people, that helped them make sense of their lives and connect with each other, remained as vital as ever. Hollywood had become both less and more than it once was. Less a physical place where dreams were controlled by powerful gatekeepers, more a global network where anyone with vision and skill could contribute to the ever-evolving language of visual storytelling. The sign still stood on the hillside, an icon of an industry that had reinvented itself many times before, and had now undergone its most profound transformation yet. But the dreams it represented had escaped its boundaries, spreading across the world in ways its creators could never have imagined.